You want to tell us your name?
Max Staker.
What's today's date?
It's August 17th, 2020.
And
100 degrees outside.
the 100? I don't
According
know.
to the thermometer I got.
I don't know if my watch says that, but oops, hit the screen there. What else? How old are you right now?
79.
79 years old. How old's Grandma right now?
She's 81.
81. Is that right?
I'll be 80 in 2 weeks.
Two,
Or about 2 weeks.
on September 5th.
Yeah.
How long have you been married to Grandma at this point?
At this point, forever.
Well, it will be forever, but what in this time frame of now, how long have you been married to Grandma?
We've been married for 60 years.
6 years this year.
Last,
60.
last July 1st.
That's a long time. 60 years.
2 years in the same house.
Lived here for 60 years.
I built this house and started it the year before we got married so that we never had to rent a house. We never paid rent. We never had a mortgage on a house. Never lived anywhere else other than right here.
That's pretty impressive.
Except 9 months with you folks.
Well, 9 months with them and 4 months in Australia and 4 months in England with work.
That 9 months seem like a long time to you, Grandma?
It was horrible.
Ask a woman that's pregnant how long 9 months is. A long time.
So let's see. Let's start with an interview question here. What's your earliest memory from your childhood? What's something you remember?
There's several things I remember that's early. It's hard to differentiate, how old you were, is all you know is that you was very young. I remember before I went to school, being at my grandma and grandpa Staker's house, which was next door to where we lived, talking about whether I was going to be able to go to kindergarten the following year. So that would have been, I would have been around 5 years old at that time. And I was a little scared about going to kindergarten. I'd rather wait and go to the first grade. And that's what happened because that was when they started kindergarten in Weber County. So they waited till I was out of age and I didn't have to go to kindergarten. So my first school was at first grade. I remember that. I remember a lot of things young. I remember hauling hay with a team of horses pulling a big wagon, and the hay was all in piles. Wasn't baling hay at the time, so I was using the horses and the old hay wagon. The old hay wagon is a wagon that came across with the pioneers. It actually had hoops, wooden hoops, that went over it to make it into a covered wagon. But I remember my dad poking his pitchfork into the hay and throwing it up over his head onto the load where I was up above and I was on top tramping it. And I guess I remember that day because one time when he was lifting it up and getting it up over his head, a big long snake fell down out of the pile of hay that he was lifting up, fell right in front of his face and about scared him to death. It was just a garter snake, a water snake, but it was finding a cool place on a hot day.
In the hay. Huh.
And so
whose wagon do you suppose that belonged to before your dad owned it?
As far as I know, it was Grandpa Staker's or his dad's, because he used it on for farming, and he kept the hoops with it. It's the same wagon wheels that I've got out in my backyard.
Okay.
It's pretty deteriorated now, but
Yeah.
they'd be over 200 years old.
Wow. Wow. You've also told me you remember when Sharon was born.
Yeah, I remember that. And Sharon's 4 years younger than me.
No, she's 5 years younger than me. Well, I guess.
So that'd be around 4 years younger than I am. So that would put me at around 4 years old.
Tell me that story again.
It was early in the spring. It was summertime, and my dad had taken Mom to the hospital to have the baby. And he was so busy on the farm, he didn't have time to stay there to see it born and stuff like that. So he came back out and was farming. Apparently, she'd been there for a day or so, but she'd been there a little while. And my grandma and grandpa lived next door to us. They told us to go down, find my dad, who was working on the tractor in the field, and tell him that we had a baby sister at the time. So I remember walking down with Val, holding the hand that he was holding onto my hand as we're walking down through the hot sand to tell Dad that we had a baby sister. So I know that was fairly young. I remember some recollections and that of the Second World War, and I don't know if it was probably the ending of the war. It almost seems like the beginning, because my folks was so upset to think the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor and that. And if it was when I was that old, I would have just been a little over a year old. But it was a traumatic, ordeal. Remember that? I remember going to the movies, which wasn't very often, but during the war, and seeing the newsreels of the big destroyer ships going through the water and shooting the howitzers off the ships, and exploding, and some of the fighting and that was going on. That was all kind of scary. And the war was over in 1945, so when I was 4 years old, I guess.
Go ahead.
To say I was born in 1940 and the war didn't start till 1941. So I was a year and 4 months old when the war broke out.
So what's some of your, I guess church was a big priority for the Staker family. What do you recall and remember from church? How is it different? How was it different back then than today?
Well, there was no TV in the first years anyway, till I was about 14. No TV, very little radio, a little bit of radio, and a crystal set that I used for my radio. And so basically, almost everything was around the church, going to church on Sunday, because at that time you'd go to church at 9 in the morning for priesthood meeting. Sunday school was around 10. Come home at noon, 11:30, 12 o'clock. Have lunch. Sometimes we'd do a little picnic up in the canyon. Then we'd come home and do chores in the evening and go to church at 7 for sacrament meeting at 7 at night. So that was, Sundays was pretty well church all day. And then any activities was word parties where you'd have a meal and dances, old folks parties, I'm not sure what other parties, but any party that came along, the 24th of July was always a big celebration. The 4th of July wasn't much of a celebration in Utah when I was growing up. It was the 24th of July was the big celebration, and more fireworks
Huh.
and more lost the video.
Oh, it might have fallen asleep. Nope, it's still there. It's going.
Okay.
Green light. You got the green light.
But everything kind of was the church, you know. I remember my grandma and grandpa Staker was on the old folks committee, and they would have been in their well into their 60s by then. And my grandpa had a 54 DeSoto, green two-tone, green and white probably. Had a Hemi V8 in it. It was real fast, car for that age. But he wasn't a fast driver necessarily. But being on the old folks committee, they had to arrange the old folks party every year and a few other parties. And they would arrange for the meal, the program. And the program was always, after you had your meal, you'd go up into the chapel area, and you'd sit just like you did for sacrament meeting, and they would have a program, and they would have musical numbers. My dad would usually play the guitar and his harmonica and sing several numbers, and other people would perform. And then the big thing was to read the newspaper, they called it.
So did you ever perform with Grandpa at all? No, you didn't sing or
And to
play an
read,
instrument?
well, I want to tell you about the newspaper though, because
Yeah.
the newspaper was someone, usually a person in the ward that was the comedian, the outspoken,
Yeah.
boisterous,
Class clown. Yeah.
Yeah, and they'd get up and they'd tell jokes. It was just telling jokes about different ones, little stories about different people in the ward, and putting their names on it to get a laugh out of it. And that was always a big thing. Was to me anyway. Was my dad performing, singing, and that because he was real good on the guitar and singing, and then the newspaper was real comical and entertaining to see. And then after that, in the evening, they would have a dance down in the gym. The gym was a small gym type or area where you had your parties and that. Had a hardwood floor on it. They'd scoot all of the benches because there's a lot of benches where you'd eat. They'd put the tables out on the floor. You'd eat there. They'd scoot the benches all out around the outer edges of it, and people could sit in a few folding chairs that sweep up because when they would eat on it, they'd put sawdust down on the floor, so if anything spilled, the sawdust soaked it up, and any food or anything that fell got swept up with the sawdust. So they'd sweep up all the sawdust, throw it out in the trash, or go burn it, and then they would put floor wax or dancing wax. It was in like a little tin can that they would shake on the floor, and that would make it real fun, and the boys would get a run and slide with their shoes, and you could slide just like it was ice for a long ways. And then they would have the dance. I used to go with my grandpa a couple of times. I remember going with him because he had to arrange for the music, and he would get this band that all I ever knew it by was the Blind Man's Band. And there was a gentleman, the older gentleman that played the piano, if I remember right, it was the piano, was blind. Could not see, but he could sure play the piano. And they had a saxophone player, and I'm not sure what else. There was about 4 in the band. And they would live music, and people would dance till about 10 o'clock, and then my grandpa would have to take them home. He would go pick them up in Ogden and take them home in Ogden. And several times I got to ride with my grandpa to take the band home, and that was kind of a treat.
let's see. So I asked you a question earlier about who was the oldest person in the Staker or Patterson family that or Bounds that you knew of. Who do you recall being the oldest person? Or
Well, my grandma Patterson, who was my grandma's mother, lived in North Ogden, not too far from where the freeway is now, just east of the Ogden Airport. And there's a steak center in the area now, a church house there.
in North Ogden? There's an airport in
Riverdale.
Ogden. Oh, Riverdale.
In Riverdale. My grandma Patterson lived down there. And I remember she had cancer, and I remember going to see her several times with my mother and my grandmother when she had the cancer, and going and seeing her. She was fairly old, and then my grandma Woodfield, I think it was the Woodfield, we always just called her little I think it was little grandma, lived with my grandma Grandma Bounds in Slaterville. And little grandma Woodfield, only had one eye. She had her other eye put out when she was a young girl. She had tied her shoelace, got tied into a knot, a hard knot that she couldn't get out. So she got a kitchen fork and was using the tine on the fork to get the knot out. And as she was looking close, slipped and took her eye out. That's what I was understood. And she lived with Grandma till she died. And that was before I was 10 years old. I was a pretty young man back then.
So you told us a lot of female relatives, but do you remember any older male?
Not the older males, no, they were all gone. My Grandma Woodfield, little grandma, she was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, she was married to John Woodfield that lived in North Ogden, where the cinemas are, where Woodfield
Farms is where my parents own their house.
Where Brent, Jill, and Krista and Derek's are building their houses there. You're gonna be living on their great grandpa's property that he owned and farmed.
Yes. Next question. What do you recall of your baptism?
My baptism was a cool day on September the 5th, 1945. Went down to the church early in the morning before priesthood meeting, so that would have been probably 8 o'clock, between 7 and 8 o'clock, which was fairly in the morning, and it was a cool fall-feeling morning. And we went to the old...
I thought you got baptized when you was 8.
Yeah.
Okay, did I say 45?
You did say 45.
Okay, 48, 1948. And we went down to the church, and in the old church, where we stood on the north or southeast corner of the basement, was a small room about 12 by 12, not very big. And in one corner, the far corner, they had 2 square built out. So you had a font, like a big well trough. And there was cement stairs that led up to the top. You could walk up and then back down into the water. It was filled by an artesian well that we used for the water for the church, which you drinking water, and then the other water around. And on Fast Sunday, they would divert the whole stream into the font there to be baptized in. So there was Romney Buck that was a week older than I was, and myself was both baptized on September the 5th, 1948, on my birthday. And then we were confirmed in sacrament meeting.
Later that evening,
Yeah.
around 7 or so, you were saying. Got a phone call.
No, that's his alarm to remind him
So-
to take a pill.
Oh,
So it's easy for me to remember when my birth or when I was baptized
because it's on your birthday.
on my birthday in 1948.
Yeah, mine's September 7th is when I was baptized, so 4 days after.
That thing will just
Keep
Make-
going.
it just drives you
Walk over
nuts.
and turn it off, Nathan.
Okay.
Just touch the circle and swipe it.
I can also hit pause. Might be easier to edit.
Tap the circle and swipe it.
That's what I'm. Oh, swipe. I was hitting tap. Let's see.
Then the propaganda.
So, did they have scouts when you were growing up, or what activities did the church do for younger boys?
Yeah, we had scouts. It was not really that well organized, especially in my 12, 13-year-old era, 14. We wasn't that well organized. We'd go down to the church and play on mutual night and play hide and seek and kids games outside and stuff like that. Didn't do an awful lot. As I got a little older, it was up to, well, I was supposed to be this patrol leader. And so one was been probably around 14, 15-year-old, I would organize them. It was, because we didn't do an awful lot, so there was 2 or 3 times I would organize a camping trip where we'd go down west of where we lived. We called it the Bottoms. It was the north run of the Weber River, and it was about a mile beyond the paved road, west of the paved road, and there was a branch of the Weber River, or a branch that emptied into the Weber River a little further south that ran by there, and there was some artesian well down there that we could get our drinking water out of, some old dead trees, and just pasture ground, bottoms they called it. And we'd go down there and play and have our fire and take our tents and sleep overnight, go back the next day. Now, by the time I got to about 16, 17, then we had some scoutmasters that was a little more organized and planned a couple of trips to the UNS fishing trips, stuff, which was a lot of fun. Got real interested in the fishing and go up and do some fly fishing in the UNS on some of the lakes up there and back in usually 10, 12 miles. Probably 8 to 10 miles we'd camp in. Seemed like 40 miles, but
Yeah, it always does when you got a backpack on, huh? Let's see. So what family trips do you remember when you were younger in that?
I remember my
Same
first
age.
trip I recollect to Yellowstone National Park was probably in about 1948, right around then, maybe even younger than that. I remember going to Yellowstone. My dad owned a 1932 Chevrolet touring car, which had nice velvet seats, nice, the back windows, the very back window and the 2 side windows on the side, if you're sitting in the back seat, had blinds that you could pull down for privacy. It was a fairly nice, car, but it was this 6-cylinder gas engine car. And we remember taking that to Yellowstone. And we got into West Yellowstone, and it was kind of dark, starting to get dark. And Mom and Dad decided to plug on, and they went on. I guess they got to Old Faithful or somewhere in there and a little further. And it started raining and blowing, and it moved into a storm. They was heading for Old Faithful, or Fishing Bridge area, which is another 30 miles probably, and they were about out of gas. I remember my mother crying or just, I won't say arguing, but disputes come up in stressful times like that. Was upset that he didn't stop and get more gas in West Yellowstone or someplace like that. And I remember getting up ways out of Old Faithful area. My dad happened to take the 1 gallon tin can that he had the white gas for the stoves and the lanterns and dumping it in the fuel tank so we could make it to Fishing Bridge. We must have made it okay because all I remember is us having trouble and Mom crying about being out of gas and we should have stopped and got gas. Because about 2 years after that, 1949, they bought a new Chevrolet that better gas mileage and more power. We took it to California and Yellowstone after that. I remember those days, but I remember real early days with the 1932 Chevrolet boxcar. It was a real box.
And they always paid cash for their cars, didn't they?
Yeah.
Can't do that now.
Mm.
It's very rare thing. You always have to take out an auto loan or home loan, like you were saying. Let's see. That's another good question. So you got the priesthood when you were 12, right?
Right.
Who gave you the priesthood?
My dad, who took care of the priesthood all the way through, was always there to support me and ordain me and make sure things was going right.
What do you remember of being that age and holding the priesthood? You passed the sacrament, I would imagine. Do you remember the first time you passed the sacrament, or?
No, not quite. The thing I remember about the church is, and this when we had the priesthood was passing the sacrament. On Fast Sunday we had, I call them the Bible thumpers. There was several old gentlemen, patriarchs in the ward, that was there, and on Fast Sunday they'd get up and bear their testimony. And us little scouts that's 12, 13 years old are all sitting on, fairly close to the front. And these older gentlemen would get up and with their patriarchal way and say how true the church is and everything's moving along and say the last days is coming, and they would start shouting and they would pound the pulpit 3 or 4 times to get their point of make sure you was listening and say, these young men that's passing the sacrament will see this Lord when he comes into the last days. We're not going to see it. I won't see it. But these young men here that's 12 that's passing, they will see the Lord. I'm 80 years old. I don't know if I'll make it or not. I'm still waiting.
How old do you think you'll live to be?
I think I'll live to be 80.
Think you'll make it to 80? After that, what do you think?
I don't know.
No guess? No gamble?
But being diagnosed with Parkinson's and everything, I don't know. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The church is true, and when, we're here for one or a few reasons. Get a body, do the best we can, and get our church work done for us while we're here on this earth, and pass on to the next. So
it's true. So we talked about your earlier childhood. What about junior high and high school? How was that different? Where did you go to? First, I guess, where did you go to school? And and what's different from when you started school versus today's youth that go to school and things like that?
Well, I went first grade through the fourth grade. I went to the old Tater School, which is only a couple of 100 yards from where I live right now. The school is still standing. It's still there, and I remember going the first 4 years there. We rode the school bus. We called it the first year or two that we was there was the school bus. It was a little bit different. It was a Cracker Jack box. It was a square. It was actually one of the old square type vehicles, trucks that was available, like a 1930, 20 or 30 something Ford or something, because it was just squared off and rickety and slow. Remember that? And then after that, then we got a more modern style bus, but it took us the mile and a half to the school, pick us up and take us home. Then after that, I went to West Weber School, then to Walquist Junior High, that was in Marriott, or Harrisville area, I guess it would be.
Was it right across from DDO?
Right across from the Defense Depot, across from now where the Veterans Hospital is, but it's all torn down and subdivisions or apartments are in there now. And then went to the old Weber High School. It was 1100 something Washington Boulevard. It was a 3-story building. I think it was a 3-story building, brick building, and went to school there. Graduated from there. But when I got to high school, it was different because it was kind of my first introduction to Ogden City. Because before then, we'd go to the Ogden for groceries once every couple of weeks. We'd go there occasionally to a movie, but didn't have much to do, in Ogden City at all. Our time was spent on the farm, doing farm work almost all summer, and just wasn't in town that much. When we went to Weber High, then from there, school bus would take us to school and take you home. But I also had the option of, if I wasn't real busy after school, I could walk 10 blocks into the heart of Ogden, 24th Street of Ogden, and then catch a ride home or walk home from there, which is another 7 miles, and I could be home. So I was able to, so we say, slum and go into town and shop and get around. Now that's where I met my wife Connie. Was there because that was one day in the fall of the year. Well, it was on Halloween that year, Halloween Eve. I walked into the J.C. Penney's in Ogden because I knew the girl that ran the elevator in there was Sharon Hayes, that lived almost a neighbor to us. She's just about a quarter of a mile further east than we was, and I knew she worked there on the elevator. And I thought, well, if I go into town and get some fishing gear or do what I want to do, she'll give me a ride home. So I went in that day after school and thought, well, I'll go to the elevator and see Sharon and ask her, and I'm waiting there for the elevator to come down. The elevator comes down and the doors opens up. Here's this beautiful young girl, and it's not Sharon. Sharon was beautiful, and she was fairly ordinary. Here's this beautiful young, good-looking lady, the other elevator operator, and it was my wife Connie. So that was the first time I met Connie. Was there, and come to find out, that was Sharon Hayes' sister. Cousin. Sharon and Connie are cousins, and she introduced me to Connie. Sharon did. I caught a ride home with Sharon that night, being Halloween, Sharon asked me, I think she did,
No, you invited yourself.
go ride around and see what the trick-or-treaters was doing around Ogden and things. So that evening, Sharon and myself and Connie, my wife, we went around, drove around, and it wasn't too long after that when we started dating, right? So we actually met on the elevator not by accident, I guess, by design. So that's the way I grew up. We're still having our ups and downs.
Because of the elevator or just life?
Well, we can blame it on the elevator.
Yeah, and I didn't really work there that long because I started working at IRS. And so if he had come, another year, then never would have met him.
Yeah, it was hard to get off the farm, huh? Hard to
Yeah.
break away.
Well, she's the only girl I ever really dated.
Oh, baloney.
Well, she was. I went out with a few other girls, but never really dated any.
Same Ken. What else was? You told me. Do you remember when the temple was built in Ogden? I'm sure that was a big.
That was a big thing because we had torn down the church we went to in Taylor and was building a new church house in Taylor. Same year, I think it was like 71 or 2. So we was and back then, when you build a church house in your ward or a stake center, you had to furnish something like 60% or a good percentage of the building cost was up to the members. So we was doing a lot of things to raise money from that for our own church and things like that. And then they built the church, the temple in Ogden, and we had to do fundraisers for the Ogden temple as well. So we built that and then got it. We never thought we'd see the day we'd get a temple in Ogden because growing up, I think there was 12 or 13 temples in the world at the time, and you had to memorize all those when you was in the primary before you could graduate.
Just like the Articles of Faith.
Which wasn't very many temples at the time, So we was real surprised to think we was able to get the Ogden Temple. Then we got the Ogden Temple, and in our later years after we retired, Connie and I was able to be ordinance workers in the Ogden Temple for 4 years before they tore it down and built the new temple. And then we was ordinance workers for 2 years when they built the new temple. And then when I got Parkinson's, it got too hard with the tremors and things to do the ordinance work. So,
Well, you mean to do the yard work?
huh?
To do the yard work? You said ordnance work. You mean the garden work?
Well, I did to do ordnance work. Because when you're doing ordnance work, you're laying on the hands. And you get shaken so bad with your hand that the person you're doing the work for
gets distracted. Yeah. Yeah. So being on the topic of temples, you and Grandma were married in which temple?
Salt Lake Temple.
Can you describe to me that day?
Our grandparents was married there, our great-grandparents, most of them, and our parents, and we was, so.
Who was all in attendance when you got married or sealed in the temple?
everybody was eligible. Our parents was all there.
Was your grandparents there, and were
Just
great grandparents? Were
just
they
Some of
alive?
my,
some of the
my grandma
grandparents.
Rawson there, and we felt very bad because my mother didn't think that my grandma Kennedy could get a recommend, and so she didn't even invite her. And then we found out later that she did have a recommend, and she was very hurt. She felt really bad that she didn't get to attend our wedding.
Yeah, we went there and Connie had her beautiful wedding gown on with all the petticoats. Had to have about 4 seats, 2 on each side of her for the gown and the petticoats to be in. She wished after she would have just used a white dress.
Yes.
Simple.
Yeah, because it really bothered my mother. She just kept saying, "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear."
But we didn't have a lot of help, or somehow we didn't get that good of advice
Yeah,
as newlyweds, you know, of what to
What to
expect, and we had no idea what was going on. We just went to the temple, and that's where it was done, and it was all a big black box to us, going to the temple and the ordinance work and everything. It probably took several years after going to the temple occasionally, because we'd have to usually go to the Logan Temple maybe once a year or every 6 months. It wasn't that often, but it took a while before I started really realizing what the temple work was really all about, I think. What all the commitments were and things. Don't you think, Connie?